everyone, and welcome to the first episode of our new podcast, Into the Dataverse. This podcast is for everyone who, like us, is super obsessed with open data. In this series, we're going to talk to founders, builders, investors, and everyone in between about what makes them bullish on the Dataverse. Today, we're talking to Michael Sena, who is the founder of the Ceramic Network. He's going to tell us what the Dataverse is and what it means to him. Hope you enjoy it, and let's dive in.
I'm Michael, co-founder of Ceramic. Ceramic's a decentralized data network that provides scale, low cost, fast data storage and availability for projects to build databases, decentralized apps, and all sorts of things with open data.
So you wrote a blog post about the Dataverse in 2022. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Dataverse is and what was behind that?
Yeah, so I think um, we were talking about the Dataverse in 2022, sort of in response to a reaction that the web was having to Facebook rebranding to Meta. And at the
Oh,
time it
God.
was, yeah, right. So Facebook rebranded to Meta and they tried to just stake a claim to this entire digital space that is like um the new virtual world, right? Again, it's sort of they plant the flag on it specifically in VR, and they tried to say that like VR was the metaverse. And so we just like fundamentally rejected that because coming from Web3, we were like, what about NFTs? What about DeFi? Like, what about all these other open systems that um, are like the next generation of the internet? And so, really, when we think about the metaverse, I think of this abstract digital world where all like goods, services, experiences, data, users, money seamlessly flow between different apps and platforms. So instead of like the web that we have today, where I go to Facebook or I go to Google or I go to TikTok, um, what if they were all built on one meta platform? That's sort of what I think of as the metaverse. And so um, yeah, it was a topical thing. I think like there were a bunch of trends happening in Web3. But I just like fundamentally disagree with Facebook being able to just take that claim. So that was sort of the origin and genesis of that article.
I feel like we all had an axe to pick with Facebook when that happened. That was the cringiest era of Web3, I think. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is there anything that's like changed for you about how you see the Dataverse or the metaverse now?
Well, so I think generally the theme of that article was really about how the metaverse is this new environment where people can exist alongside their data and alongside their apps, and everything is sort of fluidly interoperable. And I think that vision has progressed, and I would largely say is like fundamentally intact. Like we've seen actually new manifestations of that, and like the case for the metaverse and the dataverse has become stronger since then. Uh, but what was prominently missing or underrepresented in there was AI. So I think like in terms of where we were in late 2021 when we wrote that article in early 2022 when we published it was like AI was not as prominent as it is now. And that obviously came a bit out of a left field for those that weren't, deeply paying attention to the AI space. But that trend has come on really strong and fast. And so if I were to rewrite that article and vision today, obviously I would incorporate AI more strongly as a supporting point. But the conclusions we drew of that, this is the time where we're entering the golden age for developers and like the golden age for creators generally. I think those cases are pretty strong. So yeah, we missed AI a little bit, but I think the world is marching towards the metaverse.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you mentioned about the reason that we really liked your blog post, even though it was from 2022, it's still really relevant in 2024 because it really is kind of broad enough that it encompasses everything, which is what I think the metaverse intends to be and is not just like specific to whatever's trendy or big in tech at that moment. I think that the concept of having all of these like all of your data follow you and around and have the internet feel like it's made for you and have this whole like web of interconnected apps and stuff building on the same data. I think that makes sense that with AI being on everybody's mind, there's definitely a space for that in the dataverse or the metaverse.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, right? Like, and the case was that everything is getting smaller and more modular and more interoperable. The world is getting weirder. The world is getting faster, right? Like, I think these are trends that will continue at least for the foreseeable future. And so, yeah, it's really, um, I think the trend of writing micro applications now could even just be like writing a prompt for an LLM, right? Like, I think like that is technically application development now. So, as we're moving in this world of whether it's enabled by AI or whether it's enabled by open data or the combination of the two, like I think the tools and resources available um, to pull together a complete product or stack is just like light years ahead of where it was 5 years ago. And like when we first conceived of, the vision of ceramic or a web where data is fluidly exchanged between different parties online. And yeah, we're excited that the advancements in AI, blockchains, and application development generally leave for everyday people. Now, I can write an app as a prompt engineer in a couple minutes where, historically, if you had to write a full end-to-end web app with a web server, like that would take weeks. And this type of trend of, the expansion of the ways that people write apps and the interfaces that users interact with apps will keep broadening. And as it does, the effects of the Dataverse will become more obvious, right? Because the more touch points that our users are connected to, and then the more apps we interact with on a daily basis, the more important it is that our information remains portable and sovereign.
Yeah. So what does self sovereignty mean to you, like in terms of data, open data?
Self sovereignty is I think, a nuanced topic, which is historically why at Freebox and Ceramic we have always served the identity use case, but never led with it. We lead with Ceramic as being a data network, and it's a data network where all data is signed and available and it's permissionless. And so if we think about really what self sovereignty is and like really what the vision of Web3 is, I think of it as ultimate agency. And this is like to make decisions or to exist in this world. And um, I might be a bit biased. Like I come from a political economics background and I studied comparative international politics. And it really gets to the question of like, what defines a sovereign nation? Like, what is sovereignty? And if two nations exist in this world as being sovereign institutions, who has the authority to tell any of those nations what to do? Because both of them are sovereign. And I think like that is the crux of sovereignty is like you have the ultimate power to make decisions. And that is a super powerful thing. And I sort of stop at self sovereignty there because I think, in the digital world and in this open data systems that we create on Ceramic, like we believe that everyone has the right to self sovereignty. And that is sort of fundamentally designed into the system so that every account on Ceramic, every user, sensor, business, whatever, just begins as a simple key pair, right? A DID that is a key pair. And it's ultimately up to the creator of that key pair because they created it on a permissionless network that no one controls, because that network and platform that they use to create that key pair is credibly neutral and open, then like I am the only one that can decide what to do with this key, no one else. And that's self sovereignty. And at some point, like I can be because I'm the decision maker and controller of my own sovereignty, I can delegate that responsibility to someone else. And that's technically, I still had the option and the default to self sovereignty, but I gave it away. And that was my choice. But ultimately, it was my choice. And that's okay. And so I'm not like a purist in saying that self sovereignty has to be self managed keys. Self sovereignty was just that you had the choice to manage your keys and you chose to not. And so I think of that as sort of the fundamental premise of self sovereignty. And then everything flows from that, like the data controlled by that key. If you control the key, you control the data. But if you delegate that key, obviously, then you're introducing your own trust assumptions. And so self sovereignty is not super straightforward. It is a fundamental design principle of our network, and users can ultimately choose what they want to do.
Awesome. Yeah. I think self sovereignty is really critical and I guess it's really a critical part of the Web3 vision. Um, I don't know that that's like what everybody comes to Web3 wanting, but I think at least from my perspective, it's a pretty good value add. And yeah, I guess maybe if you want to talk about like verifiable data and like how that fits into the narrative.
So I think, I actually saw a tweet by Nick White, the founder of Celestia, and it just like summarized obviously a lot of what we've been saying. Like Web3 is about verifiability. Like you hear the Bitcoin term, like don't trust, verify, like not your keys, not your coins, like verification. I think that is the way that you can establish trust in systems where you might have adversarial parties, right? Like in a crypto world or in any open system, right? Like you introduce the risk of bad actors. And so how do you, protect against that? And ultimately, Web 2 is a system built on trust because it's a location addressed architecture, because you have a server that lives at a physical location, and because you have a web app that talks to that server at a physical location. Like if that server goes away or it disappears, like that data is lost. And and if another app wants to use the data of that server, it has to just trust that app, that what the answers the server is giving it are true. And so if you want to share data in a Web 2 world today, it's fundamentally built on trust. And that doesn't scale. Like trust in that way does not scale to the level that we need it to fundamentally establish the metaverse or the dataverse. And so how do you create systems built on new trust models that do scale? And instead of the Web 2 model of trust me, bro, like the Web 3 model is like actually verify it. Like you can take the data, and if you don't believe me, you can run it yourself and you'll get the same result. And that ultimately is what Web 3 is about. And you could implement strong verifiability. Like I consider blockchains strongly verifiable because they have strong security, enough verifiability to transact money and value, right? And like the amount of verifiability you need for data is a little bit less than money. And so like you probably don't need the same amount of security and chain overhead to manage data that you need to manage money. And so data, while in a Web3 context, still needs to be verifiable. It needs to be a little bit less verifiable than money. And similarly, if you keep going down all the way at the other end of that spectrum is a Web 2 API or a Web 2 database that returns a response without any proof at all. And so you are forced to trust them. And that just is an issue in the fundamental architecture challenge with the Web 2 paradigm and why Web 3 is the solution.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of like, yeah, I guess that sort of leads into a question. So when you talk about needing a level of security and verifiability that isn't necessarily as like restrictive as a blockchain where it's not scalable because it requires so much security, is that where you see like ceramic coming in and how does that look to you?
Yeah. So I think the on chain, off chain binary dichotomy is incorrect. Like to me, that is a limiting framework that excludes solutions like ceramic. So let's just throw that out the window for a second. Let's say on-chain, off-chain is not a thing anymore, and
Happy to throw that out.
the two-party system needs to be abolished. Like, I'm sorry, but the on-chain, off-chain are not the political factions that need to exist in Web3. Like, what about everyone else? And so I like to think of Ceramic as the other solution. And it's like not off-chain, which is completely unverifiable, like a Web2 server. And it's not strongly financially verifiable, where you need global consensus over every single transaction. Otherwise, we can't agree on anything. But like, what about a system that you get some of the properties of blockchain, but you get the scalability of Web 2 and you get the best of both worlds? Something sufficient for building decentralized social data pools where, AIs and LLMs can operate on, building sort of like these vast oceans of data that developers can tap into to build apps. And so like that needs to be verifiable, but it doesn't need to be on chain because you don't need double spend protection, and it can't be on a server. And so like this whole spectrum of use cases, like we've struggled for a while to define what it looks like. And it's like non-fi. It's like not value. It's like not NFTs. It's not assets. It's not money. It's non-fi. And it's pretty much 99.9% of the internet. And so like it's cool in Web3. We've been playing around with money for a long time, but like if we want to have the impact we ultimately desire, we have to approach non-financial use cases, and we need new infrastructure to do that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that is a barrier to entry for Web3 for a lot of people is they just automatically associate it with crypto or NFTs or like financial assets in general. Um, but it's so much more than that and it would actually benefit everyone. But like just keeping it about like the blockchain and only it's on chain or off chain or DeFi or whatever. I think the non-fi part is a really critical and much bigger part of how we like interact with the internet. So I think that really like zooms out and allows other people to dip their toes into like having a more secure and sovereign um internet experience, which I guess is like a life experience because we all spend all of our time online for better or for worse. So, yeah, you also had mentioned in like your blog post about how you think that like open data and the Dataverse will make developing applications more accessible. I think you mentioned like a journalism student that wants to create a database, they would be able to do that without like having any development experience. So I guess if you want to talk about accessibility and yeah, how does that benefit everyone individually and then like at a larger scale the world?
Yeah. So like, I mean, this is super exciting. Like this is why I do what I do. And it's because I fundamentally believe that this new architecture enables new apps, and it enables new apps not because it enables the same old developers to build new kinds of apps, but because it enables new types of creators to create applications. And I think that's the difference. Is like historically, development was a super specialized skill with a super specialized set of tools. And like you had to learn that skill very particularly and you had to practice it to be good. But today, like all of those problems that early developers had to solve have kind of been solved, right? You have open source libraries, you have server frameworks, you have all these tools that even before Web3 made developing applications and software easier. GitHub, for example, led the sort of advent of all of this. And so when you sort of like fast forward that to uh, what it's going to look like for developers in developers building on these open systems, right? Like kind of the metaverse or the dataverse or the blockchain and sort of the amalgamation of all of them is that all they have to do is plug in now, right? Like historically building an application, you needed to like worry about how do I technically implement this? How do I acquire users? How do I get those users to engage with my app so I could saturate my database and build enough data so I can improve the user experience for new users? And that was the sort of chicken and egg problem that every app had to face is like, how do you bootstrap network effects, right? And that is fundamentally why some succeeded and most failed. And it's also the reason for the moats and defensibility of the ones that have succeeded. And so when you start to think about what's possible by breaking down those barriers and breaking down the moats that the entrenched financial institutions have established, and you open all that data up to the innovation of crowd and of the bizarre, I think you witness what happened in Ethereum is like you open this new platform up for development and experimentation, and you witness sort of this like big bang moment in terms of experimentation. And like that's what will happen and will continue to happen as more pieces of the development stack become open source and modularized and integrated. And like that's the future we're heading towards, where now it's not a super specialized developer building an app. It's a bunch of influencers and students and creators living life and making micro applications because the interface to building those apps is near invisible. Like we said, if you're writing a prompt in an LLM today, you're writing an app. Like, and that is only going to be more prominent. And ultimately, where this ends up is like, we're not going towards a world of like a million networked applications. We're going towards a world of a billion or more applications that are all networked on top of the same data infrastructure. And, who's to say there won't be an app for every person on the planet? I'm not, because I think there could actually be more than that. And so, like, in my mind, all of this is the product of sort of making development more accessible by unlocking the creator class.
That's a really nice way of putting it, like the creator class. Uh, yeah, I mean, it seems like it's kind of a win for everyone. Maybe not like big tech, but they don't deserve another win anyway. But yeah, I think like it makes a lot of sense to make the internet or like the web more individualized and more useful. I feel like there's so much that we haven't even thought about yet that like somebody will think about and then they'll be able to do it, which would be like really cool versus, having like people that are only have very specific skills to be able to do these things. And there's no reason for them to develop something if it's not going to benefit them financially, like that type of situation, which is like, that's like how people make a living as developers.
Well, think about what happens when expression becomes more native, right? Like when, uh, if our experiences on the web were only shaped by the people that could learn how to code, we would have very bad experiences online. Instead, designers and product managers and other people got involved to make the web better. We basically gave them the ability to like, through a third party implement their ideas, right? But like, what if we could directly give them the power to implement their ideas? And what if, those ideas could be smaller and more creative? And like, I think we're headed towards a world and an internet that is much more fun and creative. And like, not everything needs to feel like a business. Like, it's just to create things and to try new things where the barrier to trial is so low that you literally just open up all possible experimentations. And then like through evolution, right? And natural selection, you have these use cases that win, but like you do that through experimentation and scale. And you don't do that through, sort of trying to protect everything and silo it.
Yeah. Um, totally. That makes a lot of sense. And it definitely sounds a lot better than what we have going now. But I definitely see where we're on the path to that. Um, what do you think right now is like preventing more Web3 developers from using um, decentralized or open databases?
I think incentive. Um, I think we have seen the believers, uh, the needers, so it's like either people that are very mission aligned with open data and self sovereignty, those projects implement open data. Projects that need to implement open data that, Gitcoin Passport or things where like they're data centric businesses and blockchains cannot scale to meet the scale requirements that they have today. And so like those projects use ceramic. But there is, this whole other set of developers that don't have such acute needs, right? Because they're exploring Web3. They don't have a project they need to scale the data infrastructure for. They're thinking about what to build in the first place. And the attention of those developers, unfortunately today, goes towards the economic opportunities that are present in Web3. Because all else equal, if I intellectually am interested in two things, I will build on the thing that has more upside or incentive. And so it's our challenge as developers of Web3 and the non-fi space to think about like what are the incentives for builders and how do we enable the creation of massive businesses in the same way that Ethereum enabled the creation of Uniswap and the creation of all of these other massive businesses. And everyone followed on trying to recreate those massive businesses. And that's why you see the sort of flourishing and vibrant Ethereum economy. So likewise, we need to recreate that in Web3. I think a lot of that can do with incentives around public data sets and sharing and contributing to these data sets. But there's still some research and development to do that's happening as a part of Ceramic.
Yeah, so cool. That's a good way to segue into my final question, which is how do you see ceramic fitting into the Dataverse? What do you see ceramic's role being in the Dataverse?
Well, first of all, the vision of the Dataverse and the metaverse is way bigger than just ceramic. So I think like that, I see ourselves more as humble stewards of the vision of what the Dataverse and the metaverse could be. Um, but, we're not naive enough to think that it is with 100% certainty going to be any technical implementation. Like the world in future marches in one direction. And so I think how we want to contribute is we want to be good stewards. Um, we have been good stewards. We've been building towards this vision since 2016 and we've stayed true to it. Like now, finally, people are starting to build in Web3 with non financial apps and with an eye towards verifiable data. But like we've been beating this drum for a long time. And so, I like to think of ourselves as not chasing a hot new thing and not sort of being swayed by the winds of public opinion, but rather like true believers. And I think that's what you'll find in the ceramic community generally is a group of true believers that are actually interested in pushing forth the vision of open data. And so when I take a step back too and think about the ceramic ecosystem and the role we can play in the stewarding of the vision of the Dataverse, I think of it in two ways. As one, we need to provide a capable, and by capable, I mean scalable, low cost, capable of supporting non-fi use cases, a capable, credibly neutral platform, basically the home to the Dataverse. And we're going to do our best. And, others might also try to create homes for the Dataverse, but that will be one of our key contributions. And the other one is we see ourselves as responsible for starting little fires everywhere, like basically figuring out how we can create the conditions for the community to adopt and sort of take on this vision and advance it themselves. And so, we really see ourselves as, yeah, we create some tech, but more than that, like we're creating the conditions by which this vision can survive and thrive. And that takes a lot of different things. So if you're interested in building with open data, I think ceramic is a good home for you.
I would agree with that. At Orbis, we've been building on ceramics since the beginning, and we're pretty happy with it. So I can back everything that you said with positive feedback from us. So uh, thank you so much for your time and for your vision. Thank you for sharing your vision with us. And yeah, hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Ollie.